Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Now we come to the final session, which is on terrorism and politics of hegemony. There is a complex nexus between hegemony and terrorism. In its pursuit of hegemonic power, the Washington elites has resorted to acts of terror from Hiroshima, Nagasaki to Baghdad and Tripoli. The acts of these are the evidence that stares at our face. Before we start, allow me to introduce the presenter. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the president of the International Movement for a Just World, an international NGO based in Malaysia, which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogues, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. Without further ado, I would like to invite Prof. Chandra Muzaffar to deliver his presentation.
Assalamu alaikum, salam sejahtera, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking my friend Dr. Farooq Musa and the other organizers of this conference for this very kind invitation. I'm very much aware of time. This is the last session, and I know you'll all be a bit hungry by the time we finish, and you know, hungry people can be angry people, and when you are angry, you may turn to be a terrorist. So that's the danger that we must be aware of. The topic is on terrorism and the politics of hegemony. I would like to define certain terms just for the sake of clarity. Terrorism, in the context of my presentation, is the deliberate killing and maiming of civilians with an agenda. Most of the time, it's political. Hegemony, in the context of international relations, would be the dominance and control exercised by a few over the many in global politics, global economy, global security, global culture, global media, and so on and so forth. Now, in pursuit of hegemony, great powers have been known to use a variety of strategies in order to establish the hegemony. My proposition is that terrorism is one of those strategies that has been used, continues to be used in order to achieve hegemony. The focus would be largely on the superpower of the day, United States of America and its allies. As far as this nexus between terrorism and the politics of hegemony is concerned, I'd like to draw your attention to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. It's clearly linked to hegemony. It was the US's way of telling the world that the United States is the dominant power after the war. The victorious power, the dominant power, but unlike a victorious power like Britain, which was totally emasculated after the war, here was a victorious power which was also very, very powerful after the war. In fact, I've argued that the United States at that particular moment, 1945, combined the various dimensions of power that no other nation had combined within itself before or since at that particular moment in 1945. And it wanted to demonstrate to the world that this power meant its command over nuclear power. Because we know now, from all the documents which have been released in the last few decades and from various writings, that there was really no need to bomb Hiroshima. The Americans knew this was a clear message to the Pacific Command that Japan was prepared to surrender. They were negotiating. There were some elements in the negotiations that had not been completed, but they were going to surrender. Nonetheless, the Americans decided to bomb Hiroshima. 250,000 people, civilians, were killed. That's terrorism. Now, if that wasn't evidence enough, what happened 3 days after that? This was 6th of August, 1945, 9th of August. What was the necessity to bomb Nagasaki? Another 80,000 people killed. It was a demonstration of power through acts of terror, separated by 3 days. And this is why I would concur completely with Noam Chomsky, who for many, many years has argued that the leading terrorist state in our time is the United States of America. The leading terrorist state in the world. That's the evidence. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Look at Latin America and the Caribbean. The acts of terror that have been committed over a long period of time, partly in pursuit of its Monroe Doctrine, because that's the area that they've always dominated. And they wanted to continue to dominate that area. You know what had happened in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, what had happened to a little country like Cuba, victim of terrorism in various manifestations, which a number of people have outlined, including the downing of a Cuban commercial airliner in 1976. A lot of the passengers were school children. And we know that the United States, through its CIA operatives, they were involved in that. Apart from, of course, bombing hotels, part of the tourist belt in Cuba and so on. Or what they did in 1973 to a democratically elected president in Chile. The assassination of Salvador Allende. 11th of September, mind you the date. It was the 11th of September, 1973. It was an act of terror. And of course, numerous other examples. Take West Asia, the Iraq War. If you look at what had happened in the Iraq War, the hundreds of thousands, some people argue perhaps 1 million civilians killed in that war. The US and its allies, again, hegemony, dominance through a war. A large part of that war expressed itself through acts of terror. What its closest ally, its intimate ally has done in that region, I'm referring to Israel, the United States' intimate ally, all the Gaza operations, if these are not acts of terror, civilians killed, 2008, again 2012, again 2014, very well documented acts of terror. So it's the United States on its own, sometimes in collusion with its allies, but the basic agenda is dominance and control of various regions of the world. Look what the United States has done in Southeast Asia, since we are looking at West Asia and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, Vietnam. And we know concrete graphic cases of acts of terror in that war. Vietnam and Laos, 4 million people killed, a lot of them civilians, in pursuit of its hegemony. Why? Because the obsession at that time was communism and China. It's not because Vietnam was a threat to the United States of America in any way. And a number of scholars, many of them American scholars, have studied this in depth, that this was hegemony. And terrorism was very much part of that attempt to dominate the region. Look at what had happened in Indonesia, 65, post-65. This was indirect. No direct occupation, unlike in the case of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In the case of Indonesia, through their proxies, through their operatives, basically to get rid of a leadership that they thought was more inclined towards communism, towards a type of nationalism that they were not comfortable with, getting rid of Sukarno and the people around him, installing Suharto, who was basically their agent. And what was the cost? 1 million people killed in the 1965 Gestapo episode and the events that followed. And this would be true of various other regions in the world, which is why I think we have to look at the cost of hegemony in terms of human lives, actually. Millions and millions of people have died because of this desire to dominate, to control, to ensure that one is the ruler of the world, that one is the ruler of the world. This is the goal. Friends, you would be aware of this, that the desire to sustain and perpetuate power is a goal in itself. It need not be linked to other goals. It's a goal in itself, and this is what it is. This is what hegemony is, and believe me, hegemony is not just at the global level. Hegemony occurs at the national level, at the subnational level, at the level of districts, at the level of the family. There's hegemony. For a long while, students of the family system have talked about male hegemony, and there's a lot of truth in that. So there is hegemony at various levels, but nonetheless, the important point to remember in the context of our discussion is that hegemony is a compelling factor because it is power. It is power. The desire to obtain, sustain, perpetuate power. Now, there is a certain dimension of hegemony and terrorism which has happened in the past, but it is important to highlight this at this particular juncture. I'm referring to the way in which great powers, regional powers, finance terrorist groups, equip them, provide them with intelligence, and yet pretend to be fighting terrorism. That is what is happening today. If you look at West Asia, it began in Iraq, 2003, and it has continued in a vicious form in Syria, where the United States, Britain, France, and regional actors, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, they played a major role in the terrorist activities in Syria. This is very well documented now. We know, for instance, that in the G20 meeting, I must ensure there's no slip of the tongue, because sometimes nowadays when I talk of G20, I talk of G25. So it's, one has to be very careful. The G20 meeting in Turkey, one of the most remarkable things that happened at that meeting was the way Vladimir Putin exposed that entire network. The financing of the terrorist groups, the people involved, people who were aware of it, the huge trucks that were transporting oil across the border, the role that Turkey was playing in this whole thing, supporting these terrorist activities. And we know also that apart from finance and equipment and intelligence, there were training camps for these terrorists in Jordan and in some of the other states. So these are people, very powerful states, and states that are not that powerful, that sustain terrorism. And yet they talk about fighting terrorism, which is why a new term that has emerged is good terrorists, bad terrorists. My terrorists, your terrorists. So it is your terrorists who are a problem, my terrorists are not a problem. Hence, you have this bizarre situation where in Mosul, the United States is fighting terrorists, and they're identified as terrorists. But in Aleppo, they're actually supporting the same brand of terrorists with some variations here and there. They use terms like moderate rebels and so on, which is one of the reasons why I'm sometimes afraid of this term moderates. Even in domestic politics, international politics, domestic politics, use this term moderates, when actually it is the same terrorists who are being supported. You call them rebels. And you give them massive support because you want to defeat Bashar al-Assad. And you want to make sure that there would be a regime change. So regime change has been a powerful motive. It is part of hegemony, regime change. Get rid of governments. We saw that happening in Libya, regime change. That is what happened in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. But in the case of Syria, it has become a huge mess. It has become a huge mess. And the story has not ended yet. But if you look at Syria in greater depth, what exactly is the underlying issue? The underlying issue is linked to the post-Cold War situation, the US agenda that was spelled out around that time, hijacked by the neocons. You just look at the writings at that time, and there was George W. Bush Sr., who was very much aware of this, not totally linked to this agenda, but nonetheless supportive of it. But the man who was very much part of it, right at the top at that time, Secretary of Defense, was Dick Cheney. The neocons, their agenda, the new Middle East. Remember, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, talked openly about the new Middle East. And this is all part of it, bringing about a regime change in Iraq, in Syria, in a number of countries. Wesley Clark, the US general, one-time candidate for the US presidency, he talked of the 7 states that were targets. Way back in 2005, these were already the targets, changes that they wanted to effect in that region. And this is what it is. Syria in itself is not that important. But because of Syria's link with Iran, Syria becomes very important. Because of Syria's link with the Hezbollah, it becomes very important. Syria is the only Arab state that is so closely linked to a Persian state. And this is not new, friends. Even in the time of Hafez Assad, the father of the present president of Syria, there was a close link between Syria and Iran. It was the only Arab state that took the side of Iran in the Iraq-Iran war. So for some people looking at this region, they say, look, Syria has to be smashed. And this is undoubtedly Israel's agenda. Israel's agenda. Syria tried to destroy the Bashar regime. Look at what happened just 3-4 days ago. Another military strike by Israel against Syria, a military barracks in Syria. And this is the 9th military strike since the beginning of this war, since 2011. Weakening Iran, targeting Iran, and of course defeating Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has a unique position in terms of Israel's view of security in that region, because Hezbollah is the only movement in that whole region, including states, that has effectively challenged Israeli power. In 2000, then again in 2006, when the Israeli Air Force felt that they should take control of the Litani River. And they failed to do that, largely because of the resistance from Hezbollah. So there is this bigger agenda. Unfortunately, a lot of Muslim groups, without any understanding of this bigger agenda, they have become ardent supporters of the oppressed in Syria. And who are the oppressed? The Sunnis. And the ones who've been manipulating this sentiment, again exploiting sectarian sentiments, Sunnis against Shias, Why? Because Bashar al-Assad is Alawite. And if you know anything about Shiism, the Alawite element is in fact marginal to Shiism. But Bashar Assad's wife is Sunni, Asma Assad. If you look at the top brass of the military, it's largely Sunni. The first generals to be killed were Sunni. The top brass of their bureaucracy is Sunni. So this whole Sunni Shia thing was deliberately concocted, not so much by the US or Britain or France. It was basically the work of the Saudis, a Sunni Shia conflict. And they had exported that because they have been in the forefront of this Sunni Shia conflict, fueling sentiments, distorting realities, lying, twisting, in order to pursue the agenda. Supported by Qatar, which again had recently built a mosque in honor of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi sect. And Turkey, its own agenda, of course different from Saudi and Qatar, but Turkey has its own agenda, which is of course linked to its Ottoman past and connected with its present links to the Ikhwanul Muslimin and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the opponent of the Bashar al-Assad regime, seen as secular, seen as un-Islamic, and therefore it is a regime that has to be opposed. For us in Malaysia, if you look at it from that perspective, the Bashar al-Assad government, it is not a democracy. We all know that. It's authoritarian, it has got a secret police, it has indulged in torture, we know all that. But in terms of the way it has managed a multi-religious society, Syria is remarkable. It is really remarkable. In terms of the interaction between the different groups, they've done much better than any other Arab country. This is one of the very few countries in the Muslim world, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, whatever the religious denomination, where Christians walk into a mosque and they pay their respects to the remains of John the Baptist in the Umayyad Mosque, where you have the Grand Mufti of Syria, and not just this present Mufti, even his predecessors, telling the world openly, I am the Mufti of not just the Muslims, but also the Christians. And the Bishop of Syria saying the same thing, that I am the head of not just the Christian church, but of everyone, the 23 million Syrians. They had built up that sort of understanding of one another, which is really something that is outstanding. But that is being destroyed by fanatics, a lot of them imported from outside, fanatics with this very narrow, bigoted view of the world, total distortion of Islamic teachings in order to perpetuate their own interests. They have unwittingly perhaps fallen into the trap of a larger hegemonic agenda, including youths from here who have gone over to fight in Syria without even knowing what these issues are. I met some of these young people. I didn't meet any of these terrorists, but young people who were supporting this 5 years ago. And I asked them how much they knew about Syria and what the actual situation was. It was just blind allegiance to certain ideas, religious ideas, a certain dogma, and this is what really moved them. And this, I think, is one of the major shortcomings of the Muslim world. The way in which dogma very often triumphs over rationality. Dogma triumphs over reality. You don't actually try to understand situations. You don't apply your thinking. You just get carried away by some religious teacher, especially if you have someone of stature, saying we must all support NATO in this crisis. We must all support Saudi Arabia in this crisis, and if the person is a religious preacher of stature, everyone believes him. And we get caught in this. This, I think, is a challenge that Muslims will have to deal with. How we look at religious teachings, dogma, and the way in which we sort of fail to understand actual situations, apply reason and thinking to the situations that confront us. Friends, so this is a challenge that confronts us. How do we, Muslims, non-Muslims, everyone, how do we deal with terrorism? Since I've linked what I've described here largely with the United States as a state that is linked to terrorism in various parts of the world, I think the decline of the United States of America as a global power would also see the decline of certain aspects of terrorism. Terrorism is not going to disappear completely. It was there before the United States of America became a global power. It has been there for a long, long while. We know that. It is not going to disappear completely. But I think a substantial aspect of terrorism will come to an end with the decline of the United States as a global power. And it's declining, we know, friends, because of domestic factors. That's one of the major reasons why the US is declining as a power. It is also declining because of the emergence of new centers of power. China, as far as its economic dynamism is concerned, Russia, its military assertiveness, these things are beginning to change the global landscape. And it will continue. These are irreversible trends. China is not going to decline simply because the president-elect of the United States of America wants to reverse the one China policy. China will continue to exhibit its economic prowess. Likewise, I do not think Putin, who I think seriously contests the existing global power structure, I don't think he's going to change simply because Trump thinks that he can be good friends with Putin. In other words, changes are taking place. But while these changes are taking place, friends, there's something that we must keep in mind. A superpower, a global hegemon, when it is at its pinnacle, is a danger to humankind, because hegemony by definition is a threat to humankind, to respect, to dignity. It is a threat to all of us. But let me say this, that if there's a greater threat to humankind than a hegemon at its pinnacle, if there's a greater threat to humankind than a hegemon at its pinnacle, it is when that hegemon is in decline. It's a greater threat. It may sound ironical. When the hegemon is declining, it's an even greater threat than when it is at its pinnacle. And that's what we are witnessing now. It's like a wounded tiger. It will not give up its power. There'll be no peaceful transition as far as this phase in history is concerned. Perhaps from Britain as the leading power at one time to the United States of America, it may have been a more or less peaceful transition. But there's no peaceful transition here, whatever people may say. It'll be bloody, it'll be brutal, there'll be wars, there'll be a lot of suffering, friends. There'll be pain, there'll be misery, as far as this change is concerned. But it is bound to take place. A lot of us will suffer in the process. But I think where activists, academics, civil society actors can play a role, I think we should stand up and say that we would like to see a different world. We don't want this sort of hegemonic global power structure. We want to start with a multipolar world, which must lead to something else, because a multipolar world is not the ultimate. We need a world where all nation states will be treated with respect and they'll be able to play their role. It'll take time, but this is a process that we should encourage by speaking out. And you'll be surprised to hear this. I think the people who have impressed me most at this point in time were prepared to speak up against this hegemony and who are prepared to work towards a multipolar world, a different world where there's more equity in international relations, among the people who are doing this are actually a lot of Americans, a lot of Americans, a lot of groups. One doesn't even hear of them, but they are there. If you're part of civil society and you're part of that sort of network, whether it's on the issue of Palestine, Israel, or on the issue of the South China Sea, on issues connected with nuclear weapons, these groups are speaking up. They're not well funded, they're struggling to survive, but they are speaking up. And you have groups in Europe that are very vocal, very, very vocal. And I'm glad that these two centers, they are playing a major role in this transformation. I find that in other countries, many of these groups are not that aware of or alert to what is happening, including our own country. When it comes to global issues, changes of this sort, I find that there is not much attention, even amongst our academics, amongst our activists and so on, which is a pity. But let's try to do what little we can. Use the new channels of communication that are available to us. And as we struggle against terrorism in all its manifestations, without making any distinction between good terrorists, bad terrorists, against terrorism per se, I think we have to go beyond that, friends, and make this a struggle against violence. Violence is bigger than terrorism per se. It has to be a struggle against violence. Violence in politics, violence in societal relations, in relations between communities. We have to struggle against violence as such. And that, to my mind, is the real challenge. It's going to be a long, long battle. But like all struggles in history, nothing comes easy. And we must be prepared to commit ourselves to what I regard as perhaps the greatest challenge of the future. Bringing about a more just world, a more compassionate world. But we have to address the fundamental issues that confront us. Don't shy away from them. Speak up, even if it is at your own personal well-being that you have to suffer as a result of it. You just have to speak up. That's the only way in which we can change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chandra Musafa, for a very compelling presentation dealing with very important issues in a very high-minded way. My question is at a little bit more lower level, more applied. You know, when we look at history, there have been hegemons in the past, and the ones in recent memory, I guess, that you can just cite by example. Britain, also before that, Imperial China, perhaps one of the longest period of where we have a particular country or civilization operating at the highest levels. But of course, those were during times when international transport wasn't the way it was subsequently. Then Britain, the construction of the British Empire, that lasted very long, several hundred years, I think. The next thing, the next notable one was the American era, if you like, okay? But America itself is only less than 250 years old, of which 70 years they operated at the highest levels. Why do we think that it would come to an end soon? And so I'm just asking for insights into the inner workings of American society that you might be aware of, that lead you to think that way. Because if we were to judge by American science, American commerce, finance, military power, it seems to continue to be very vibrant, able to attract talent from all over the world. Albeit, I mean, I would recognize that this structure operates on high levels of debt. That possibly could be a problem, but I think, I personally struggle to see why one would think that American ascendancy would reach a turning point in the near future. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Batul Abdul Samad. I'm from Iraq. I represent myself. First of all, I'm Shia. So wherever I go, I heard that Shia is the source of all these wars and this chaos in the region. Actually, I have one question. What about the civil war in the Algeria in 19th? And what about the civil war in Libya nowadays? And what about the clashes and instability in Egypt now? These three states, three countries, very powerful, have oil, Sunni, and there is no influence in Shia and for Shia in this area. So what's going on? I think the only reason is politics and oil and some huge amount of hatred, that's all. Thank you.
My name is Rizal. I wanted to have your opinion on what do you see America, is America really fighting the Wahhabis? Because at one hand it says it recognized Wahhabism as part of the problem for world terrorism. But another America supported Saudi, giving them free hand of attacking Houthis in Yemen and of course Syria, Saudi, Qatar, and you know the whole shebang. And that is one question. Another question is, do you see, because you mentioned about the transition, America is going down. So do you see how soon Israel is taking over? Because after British we have America, and then obviously I think Israel is the next one commanding, you know, taking over the place, the vacuum. So how soon do you think it is going to be materialized? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Like questions in the earlier sessions, you know, they've all been good questions. Yeah. Now, the first one from our friend here, if I may begin by disagreeing with you about China. China has never been an hegemonic power, the way in which Britain was, and more so the United States of America. It was an important nation, a powerful nation. We know that right up to the 18th century, something like 25 to 30% of the global GDP was actually from China. So it was important in that sense, in terms of its economic power, but it didn't conquer other lands. It didn't control the seas. It did not control airspace. It did not do any of those things. It did not take over. It did not take over resources, other people's resources and so on. You know, it is remarkable that if you look at China, in terms of its history, the best example would be from the 16th century. When the Chinese were plying the seas, 15th, 16th century, you had Portugal and then Spain, very small countries compared to China. China had the biggest armada in the world, but did not conquer 1 inch of anyone else's territory. This is a fact. We just have to acknowledge this. Cheng Ho, in his 7 voyages, he was offered land, actually, in order to settle certain disputes. He refused. So China has been consistent in the past, when it comes to conquering lands, occupying other people's territory, which are all the characteristics of imperial powers. It never was an imperial power in that sense. It was a big nation, an important nation. It had the technology at that time, the technology of that epoch in history, but it did not do what many other powerful states had done. I contrasted it just now with Portugal. You know, tiny little Portugal in the Indian Ocean. If you look at what was described as the Vasco da Gama era, the book by K.M. Panika, you look at the way Portugal treated its enemies, the way they burned ships and massacred people. And this was a very small country with very small ships at that time. But it was brutal, just brutal. So I think we have to acknowledge this, that the Chinese, if you look at their past, it is a different story. And in Malaysia and in other countries, those of us who are in Southeast Asia, we should try to understand China properly. In other words, let's not exaggerate, over-dramatize the rise of China, the threat it poses to all of us and so on. Let's look at it very realistically. China is our neighbor. Is our neighbor. And that is a geographical factor that will not change. Geography is much more important than geopolitics or, who is in power at a particular point in time. We have to keep that in mind. But at the same time, we have to be very realistic. That may be the past. There's nothing to guarantee that China may not change in the future. Yeah. I mean, you're right. New technologies and all the rest of it, China may change in the future. It can happen. So we must be alert. There are some issues where I think we should take a very firm stand. And early on, my friend Sufyan had raised this thing about the South China Sea. I agree with him that if this region has to be given a name, it should be Nusantara. It should not be the South China Sea. Because, I mean, leaving aside what you said about trading with the Firaun and all the rest of it, we don't even know whether it really happened or not. But what we do know is that there were people from this region who traveled to faraway capitals, who traded, who were skilled in navigation and maritime affairs and so on. In the Philippines, in their dispute with China, if you look at the arguments that they put forward some of these arguments, that this whole region, people living in this region were very much part of the maritime presence of that region. And for China to claim this region, if you look at the way in which they have staked their claim, because they had named those places. And I'm glad that the Judicial Committee in the International Court of Justice rejected that. Because just because you name, it doesn't mean that you have ownership, that you have rights over that area. I think that is a very important point that was made. So yes, China has done some things now that is a cause of concern. It's a cause of concern, including South China Sea and in some of the other disputes. But at the same time, I think the Chinese have also behaved quite well. If you look at certain other disputes that they've been involved in, like the Sino-Indian dispute over the McMahon line, the Chinese actually withdrew after scoring a victory. And even if you look at the negotiations, the Chinese side has been much more reasonable than the Indian side. The negotiations that have been going on for some time when it comes to the McMahon line. And there are other areas too. Don't forget that they have settled at least 18 territorial disputes peacefully. Of course, others still going on with certain countries. But let's be aware, let's be alert to the situation. But your main question was about the US, brother, and why will it come to an end? One can't say it's going to come to an end in 3 years' time, or 4 years' time, or 5 years' time. We don't know. There is someone, though, an analyst, very well-known name, Johan Galtung, who has written a great deal, and very interesting character, who says that 2020 is the end of American hegemony. Another 3 years, 2020. Now, here's the guy who also, and this is the interesting part, who was one of the very few social scientists, political scientists, who predicted the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, this guy. But I don't believe this. I mean, when you look at it in a hard-nosed way, I can't see how everything is going to end by 2020. But then look at some of the trends. The US's military power. If military power is a guarantee, if military power guarantees one's dominance, I don't think it has helped the United States. Vietnam, it did not help. It was militarily the more powerful, but in the end it was defeated. If you look at Afghanistan, One can also argue that military power hasn't really helped. If you look at the situation in Afghanistan, because the Taliban are really very powerful. If you look at Iraq, 2003, it hasn't helped. Military power hasn't helped. So military power, I don't think one should regard that as the ultimate guarantor of one's dominance. If you look at the other pillar of US dominance, of US hegemony, it's finance, the dollar, the American dollar. It is in crisis, more so now than maybe 20 years ago. There's much more global trade taking place in other currencies apart from the US dollar. And even if you look at the basket of currencies that is being talked about as an alternative, you find that people are now giving quite a lot of weight to the yuan and to the yen and other currencies which have become much more important than in the past. People are trading in each other's currencies now much more than in the past. So there is a change that is taking place. But the other thing that's very significant, which I think people in the academic world would have noticed, if you look at scientific papers that have been produced in the last few years, it is just amazing how China has come up with such a huge number of scientific papers. And that is very, very important, because in the ultimate analysis, it is your control over science and technology. It is not what it was 20 or 30 years ago. The US is still, you're right, brother, number one in the world. Still the most innovative country in the world, still scientifically the country that is right at the top. But the others who are catching up quite rapidly. And whether it is space technology, or if you look at even medicine, the Chinese have made a lot of advances. So things are changing. And I'm quite certain that there would be changes in the long run. Yeah? About Algeria, civil war, Libya, Egypt, and I think the basic question was actually about the Shia that the sister was asking, that all these crisis centers, the Shia are not involved. These are all Sunni majority countries, and you're right. There may be people who try to blame the Shia for everything. I'm not one of them. In fact, I've been very, very critical of the way in which we have demonized the Shias in Malaysia. I've been very, very critical. I think it's very unfair. It is not based upon facts. We don't even have a Shia community to speak of in this country, friends. If you're talking of a real Shia community, how many Shias are there in Malaysia? And a lot of them are actually Shias who are from outside Malaysia. I mean, not indigenous Malays who are Shias. There are a few, and they've been there before. In Kedah, for instance, you've got a Shia mosque, and you have a small Shia community. But generally, the Shias are very, very small and infinitesimal in this country. But we have made this into a big issue about the Shias, and I think this is politics. This is linked to Wahhabi influence over government and the religious establishment in this country. It has increased a great deal in the last maybe 5 years, 6 years. Some very influential people are pushing the anti-Shia line, which I think is very unfortunate. It's when they discovered that at a time when our economy was not doing well, our export of palm oil to Iran had suffered a bit, they began to sit back. And they thought, again, economics, very important. They thought, well, we can't pursue this because we may not be able to sell our palm oil to Iran. So some changes here and there, but nonetheless, I think that hostility lingers on against the Shia. And even in the context of West Asia, which is your question, sister, I do not think it is the rise of the Shias of the new crescent, as King Abdullah of Jordan puts it, that this is the real challenge. I don't think so. I don't think the real issue in West Asia is Sunni Shia. And mind you, in the context of West Asia, the Shia percentage is much higher than, say, in Southeast Asia, as far as the total Muslim population is concerned. In fact, look at Iraq, 60% Shia, Iran, you look at the whole region, West Asia, look at Lebanon, look at Bahrain, so the Shia percentage is quite high, but nonetheless it's still Sunni majority. That whole region is Sunni majority. And if you go back and look at it historically, I always give this example, friends, if you can. bear with me for another second on this issue. If the Sunni Shia issue is that critical, the way in which some of the Saudi Wahhabi elite have tried to project this issue as really central to the whole region, why is it that before the Islamic Revolution of Iran in 1979, the relations between the Saudi elite and the Shah of Iran, the relations were very good. The Shah of Iran was also Shia. It was still a Shia ruling elite. In fact, it was much more steeped in traditional Shiism. And you had the Saudis, they were all good friends. Things changed only after the revolution because they saw the revolution as a challenge to monarchical power. It was basically that, to the power of the royal houses, the feudal houses, and the Saudis felt that they had to defend this. And then, of course, they linked it with their own anti-Shia sentiment, which has been quite strong among the Wahhabis for a long time. You go back to the founder of Wahhabism, there is a strong anti-Shia, anti-Sufi dimension in Wahhabism. And that, I think, is what has been happening. So I don't think this is a challenge. It is a pity that Muslims have allowed themselves to be divided on this issue. And those who want to manipulate divisions and dichotomies within the Muslim world, I think they would say, yes, this is something we should manipulate because this is the Achilles heel of the Muslim world because people get worked up. They get really worked up on this question of Sunni and Shia. And let me also say this in all fairness, that I find that there are a lot of Shias now, and one time they were different, who because of what has been happening, and perhaps because of other reasons too, they've also become very conscious of their Shia identity. And they have also become very angry with the present situation, and they've also taken positions which I think are untenable. The Muslim world should address this challenge. Many of us, we are people who don't count, but in our own small ways, we have tried to, address this issue. There was an attempt that I made together with my colleagues in Just in 2013, May 2013, a joint statement that we helped to craft in the name of a Sunni leader, Dr. Mahathir, and a Shia leader, the former president of Iran, Muhammad Khatami. A joint statement asking for a halt to the killings and so on. Unfortunately, many of the Muslim groups did not pay much attention to it. There was some attention in Indonesia, in Malaysia, a little bit of media coverage, and in Iran, but the vast majority of Muslim countries, Muslim media, they just ignored it. So this is what is sad. When Sunnis and Shias kill one another, it makes the headlines. When there's an attempt to bring people together, you find that the media is not interested. This is the challenge that we face. Yeah, I think there's one other question, I'm sorry, sister, about the US stand on Wahhabism, right? Why is it that, you had two questions, that they seem to be supporting the Wahhabi position in Yemen and in Syria, and yet they're supposed to be against this sort of narrow Wahhabi thinking. It's partly the confusion that reigns in certain circles within Washington, I think, at this stage when it comes to the question of terrorism, Wahhabism, and all the rest of it. It is also part of one's maneuvers, I think. You're supporting the Saudis in Yemen, or the Saudi position in Syria, because it also serves the larger US geopolitical goals in both Syria and Yemen. Yemen is quite strategic if you look at it in terms of its geopolitics. And if at the level of rhetoric, the US government expresses reservations about the Wahhabi notion of Islam and so on, I think that again, it's got a certain constituency to appeal to its own domestic constituency and Muslims elsewhere. They say we don't support this, but in reality, when it comes to geopolitics, they take on a different position. You also had this question about Israel succeeding the United States as the next global power. I don't think that's going to happen. The United States is linked to Israel. Israel is linked to the United States. How that relationship will work out in the next few weeks and months, we don't know. There are two events that are taking place. One is the Paris meeting on Israel-Palestine. Both Israel and Palestine won't be present at that conference, but this is the French initiative. And then you have, of course, Trump becoming president in the next 3 days. And he has got a certain position on Israel. And again, we don't know how it will really work out in reality, you know. So let's see how things work out. And in the meantime, those of us who are committed to peace, to the idea of different peoples living together, 3 religions, 2 peoples, you know, living together, I think we should continue to pursue our goal.
I'm Shukri. You state that China is not about imperialism, but now China is lending money to countries, and this creates dependency. Is this a new form of imperialism? That's my question to you. Thank you.
How this issue will be taken into account by religions, and also what will be the impact in terms of geopolitics regarding also the religion? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mariam from Iran. I'm a PhD student at UPM University. Actually, I'm agreeing with you with most of the points you mentioned. Only I feel like look at the issue from a humanitarian approach, not a political approach. Actually, I think that we have a major problem in Middle East as Muslims are too politicalized, and they take the role of America too high in their problems. Then they concentrate in America. We just heard about Burma issue, that kids are burned alive, but because no America is there, nobody cares. No Shia, no Sunni. I just wonder what's the problem? Because if there is anywhere we have to send troops or spend money or send jihadists, that's Burma, who really needs help. But I don't see anybody care. And also, we know America chemically bombed Japan, but Japan is the 4th most developed country in the world right now. And I don't know why we take this problem. I'm not defending America. I know the conspiracy behind, but why we just wait to see what they are doing? Then why don't we take the right measures? I mean, why don't look at it like humanities? Like we always try to fight against America, but I don't know how to put it, but I think that we are too much American conspiracy centered. This is my feeling.
Thank you very much for the questions. Very quickly, because you know what I said at the beginning about hunger and anger, I have to try to give short, succinct answers. Now about China lending money or investing, which I think is a concern in some circles in Malaysia. In themselves, I don't see these as activities that will lead to the decline of our sovereignty or that we will be controlled by China because of this. I think a lot depends on what actually goes into the details as far as investment agreements go, trade agreements. Of course, China is interested in spreading its influence. One is absolutely right about that. China has offered money to a number of countries in Africa and some Latin American countries too. And there would be certain motives of this sort, you know, wanting to set up maybe a Confucian Institute in Chile, or, you know, to find ways of spreading Chinese influence. It would be there. As I said earlier, in response to another question, we have to be alert, but at the same time, let's not overreact. The moment this happens, oh, China is a threat and we must stand up against China, I think that would be very, very unwise. It would be very, very unwise. If you look at the Malaysian situation very quickly, if you are looking for investments at this point in time, the only country that is able to invest, if you look at China's reserves, The only country that is able to invest is actually China on a huge scale. And some of that investment, and I think you alluded to the One Belt, One Road project, Obor, which, in Bahasa Malaysia, Bahasa Indonesia, Obor is flame. So that One Belt, One Road thing, and also China's commitment to the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and perhaps even if you look at China and its relationship with the other countries, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. If you look at all these things, I think you can see these as very positive moves. They are positive moves because they'll also benefit us. I'm seeing it in terms of the countries that would benefit from all this. The OBOR projects, tremendous benefit to the world in terms of infrastructure development. And this is an area that has been neglected in global politics and global economics for a long while. The central significance of infrastructure development on a massive scale. And if economies are going to be transformed, it's something we should welcome as a result of investments of this sort. So I don't think we should be unduly worried, but nonetheless, I think we should very carefully look at situations, study individual situations, and look at trade agreements and investment policies and so on. The question about climate change, stand of religions and geopolitics. I'm glad you asked this question because it gives me the opportunity to pay tribute to one of the greatest interlocutors, one of the greatest spokespersons on behalf of shared values in the world, who took a very clear position on climate change, the environment, from a religious perspective. This is the late Christopher Weeramantry. Many of you here may not have heard of his name, but Weeramantry is such a big name in terms of interfaith dialogue and questions pertaining to the environment and so on. He just passed away a couple of weeks ago at the age of 90. Now, this man, he has written a book which you should try to get if you can. It's called Treading Lightly on the Earth. Treading lightly on the earth. Now, that actually is a line from the Quran. Treading lightly on the earth. Weeramantry is a Catholic. He's a Catholic. His knowledge of all the religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism. In fact, he deals with all these religions in that book of his and other books he has written. He has shown how intimate is the link between religion and religious philosophy and the environment. It is because this was not central to the philosophy of development in so many of our countries after we achieved independence, we didn't make this central that we are faced with an environmental crisis. Because if we had understood this, how important the environment is from our own religious philosophies, we would have approached development from a different angle altogether, right from the beginning. We didn't. We didn't. So there is an intimate link between religions and the environment. And the environmental crisis is due in part to our inability to link with the underlying values and principles in our religions. Instead, we are all the while obsessed with the superficial forms and symbols in our religions. We don't look at these underlying values and principles, which is what we should have done right from the beginning. Now, you were wondering whether it's linked to geopolitics in any way. I think if we had a different outlook on development based upon values and principles like this, our attitude towards other countries, towards the big powers, towards middling powers would be quite different. But we don't adopt that sort of approach. This, I think, is the root problem. I mean, even if you look at countries like China, in its enthusiasm for development, it has never really emphasized the environment. It's only now that it's beginning to talk about the environment, about green technology and so on, but not when it started off post-1978, Deng Xiaoping and so on. This was not part of their thinking at all. The last question about us ignoring issues like Myanmar, humanitarian issues and so on. They are very important. No one should ignore issues of this sort. You're moved by what has happened in Myanmar. We all are very concerned about this. And there are groups everywhere that are part of this campaign. I think some of the most vocal campaigns on behalf of the Rohingyas and other victims of the policies of the Myanmar government and the military in particular, some of the most vocal advocates are actually in Britain, in some of the other European countries, Netherlands, for instance. They're very, very active. Just for instance, my own little organization, we are part of an attempt to set up a tribunal, which would be London-based on the plight of the Rohingyas, together with people like Bangsar and others. So we are trying to work on it. There are a lot of people who are concerned about this. Yeah? And you were saying that there is this obsession with the United States of America. I think there is an obsession at the level of the elites. They're the ones who play this game all the while. And we are sometimes forced to react because you have to take into account this challenge. But I agree with you that when you look at the questions of power, of humanity, you have to go beyond a particular nation state or even a particular civilization. You have to look at it in terms of the human condition. Those of us who are in international relations, here, Rashila and Prof. Clive Kessler and all of us, we are very, very concerned about the human dimension too. But we can't avoid looking at these structures and patterns of power, because only then would you be able to understand what is happening. That's the challenge that faces us. Thank you.
We have come to the end of this conference. We hope that your time was well paid off and justified. We'd like to thank again our speakers today, Professor Chandra, Mr. Wynne, and Professor Rashila, for their enlightening presentations. Thank you for being patient with us as well in regards with our questions and our keen remarks. Finally, please join me for closing thanks to the organizers, IRF, Asia-We, Ferdowsi Institute, and ICMAS UKM. Now, we'd like to invite everybody for lunch. Enjoy your time and follow-up presentations. Thank you. Have a nice day.